They came seeking salvation, but found something older than God waiting in the woods. In the winter of 1820, a caravan of settlers vanished somewhere along the jagged ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. They were families, preachers, farmers, men and women fleeing famine and persecution, carrying their Bibles, their tools, and their hope for a better world. They built their settlement deep in a valley no map recorded, a place the native tribes had long avoided, whispering of the hollow that hums. To the settlers, it was just land, rich soil, a river close by, and silence as pure as prayer. They named it Black Hollow. It would soon be wiped from history. For the first few months, the hollow thrived. Crops grew faster than expected, animals fattened unusually well, and the settlers believed they had found God's favor. But it began with small things: whispers through the trees, dead birds gathered at the edge of town, and the sound of something shifting beneath the ground after sundown. When their preacher, Father Elias Boone, began complaining of dreams filled with a white figure humming beneath the moon, few took him seriously. But when he disappeared one Sunday before service, leaving behind a half-burnt sermon marked with strange circles and a crude drawing of a face, everything began to unravel. With the preacher gone, fear took the pulpit. The midwife, Martha Clay, assumed a strange authority. She claimed that Boone had not been taken. He had been chosen. She said the land was ancient and alive, that it demanded acknowledgement, not worship. And so, she began leading moonlit gatherings on the edge of the woods. She told them the land could protect them, but it needed something in return. When the settlers questioned her, she would only say, "Faith requires flesh." Children began waking in the night screaming that something was singing beneath their beds. Livestock were found gutted yet untouched by wolves. The town blacksmith, Jacob Hayne, was the first to run, or so they thought. His boots were later found at the well, tied neatly together, beside a small wooden carving of the moon. Winter thickened, and with it, madness. The settlers stopped working the fields, stopped burying their dead, and began building small effigies from wax and bone. By the following spring, the hollow was nearly silent. Travelers who passed through claimed to hear hymns at midnight and see a single lantern flickering deep in the valley, moving as if carried by invisible hands. Years later, in 1835, an early government inquiry attempted to locate the missing settlement. Only fragments were found: charred wood, a few scattered belongings, and a buried chapel built entirely of timber and bone. Inside were 9 skeletons positioned in a perfect circle, their mouths filled with wax. One was clutching a book of psalms fused shut by heat. The writing on the wall, carved into the altar, read, "The soil remembers what it is fed." Historians dismissed it as hysteria, a failed colony overcome by famine or madness. But the locals, descendants of nearby mountain families, still refuse to build near the site. They say the earth there breathes when the moon is full. They say if you listen closely, you can hear the faint hum of voices rising from beneath, calling names that no one alive remembers. No official record of Black Hollow remains. No map marks its location. Yet every few decades, hikers and wanderers vanish along that same ridge, their camps found eerily arranged, sleeping bags forming a perfect circle, food left untouched, fire still burning. Whether the settlers of 1820 were victims of starvation, superstition, or something unspeakable that fed on belief itself, no one can say. But the Appalachian woods hold their silence well, and when the night is still enough, it feels as though the hollow is waiting for prayer, for flesh, or perhaps for the faithful to return. The year was 1820, and the Appalachian frontier was a wilderness of both promise and peril. Families from the eastern colonies journeyed westward, drawn by the promise of land untouched by war and taxes. They came in wagons creaking under the weight of dreams. Tools, Bibles, livestock, and hope bundled together beneath tarps that leaked in the rain. Among these settlers was Elias Boone, a preacher whose faith was said to be strong enough to part clouds. Alongside him were 15 families, bound by hunger and belief that God rewarded the brave. Their destination was a valley locals called Black Hollow, a place unmarked on any official map, but whispered about by trappers and Cherokee guides as a hollow that hums. The first sign came before they even reached it. A constant, low vibration filled the air as they descended through the trees. Not quite sound, not quite movement, something that seemed to pulse in their ribs rather than their ears. The animals grew restless. Horses bucked at shadows, and the dogs refused to enter the valley. Boone calmed them with prayer, his voice steady but his eyes uneasy. "The Lord made all things," he said, "even the strange ones." The hollow itself was breathtaking. A river cut through its center like a vine of silver, and the soil, dark as ash, crumbled rich between their fingers. They built quickly, cabins from oak and chestnut, fences from pine. At night, they gathered around fires and sang hymns that rose and disappeared into the mist. For a time, there was peace. But peace in the wilderness never lasted long. Within a month, the settlers began noticing peculiar patterns in the land. The trees grew in perfect circles, as if arranged by unseen hands. Mushrooms sprouted in lines that led to the river. And every night at the same hour, the wind stopped completely, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed against their ears until they could hear their own blood moving. Boone called it God's quiet, a sign of divine presence. But the midwife, Martha Clay, an older woman known for her healing herbs and sharp tongue, whispered a different truth. The hollow's been fed before. It remembers who feeds it. The settlers dismissed her talk as superstition. They built a small chapel near the river and held Sunday gatherings. Boone preached from the book of Genesis, declaring this land a second Eden, pure, unclaimed, and theirs to tame. Yet behind his voice some swore they could hear something else, a low, rhythmic hum that pulsed beneath his words like the sound of breath in a cavern. By midsummer, odd things began to happen. Crops grew twice their size but spoiled overnight. Milk curdled moments after being drawn. And at night, the children spoke of the white man in the trees, a figure who watched but never moved. One boy, Samuel Griggs, refused to sleep, claiming the figure sang without a mouth. Boone visited him and prayed over his bed, but afterward, he too stopped sleeping through the night. Then came the first disappearance. Henry Collier, a farmer known for his temper, was last seen chopping wood near the forest edge. His axe was found the next morning embedded in a tree, clean, polished, untouched by weather. His boots stood neatly beside it, laces tied, as if he had stepped out of them mid-stride. No footprints led away. The men searched for days, finding nothing but strange grooves in the soil that seemed to spiral outward like ripples. Boone declared Collier lost to wolves, though no one truly believed it. In the following weeks, the settlers began carving small wooden crosses to hang above their doors, but Martha Clay replaced hers with a symbol no one recognized, a circle with lines radiating from its center. When asked about it, she said, "The cross belongs to heaven. This one keeps the ground quiet." The hollow grew restless as the leaves turned. Nights lengthened, fires burned lower, and more strange sounds began to echo from beneath the ground. It was not wind. It was not water. It was a pulse, slow, deliberate, almost human. Boone forbade the settlers from speaking of it, warning that fear was a door through which darkness walks. Yet he, too, grew thinner, quieter, his once booming sermons now whispered and halting. Then one morning as frost crept across the valley, Boone was gone. His cabin door stood open. Inside, his Bible lay open to the book of Job, a passage underlined in charcoal. "The earth is changed as clay under the seal, and they stand as a garment." Beside the Bible was a page torn from his journal. Only 4 words were legible: "The hollow has teeth." Panic spread like sickness. Martha Clay declared that the preacher had been taken in trade, that his blood had sealed a pact older than any scripture. Some believed her. Others called her blasphemer. But by the following week, 3 more settlers vanished. Their houses were found empty, their fires still burning, and every clock in town stopped at the same hour, 3:03 in the morning. By the year's end, Black Hollow was a village of whispers and ash. The once pious settlers had turned to rituals of their own making, burning herbs, chanting old words they didn't understand, and leaving food at the edge of the well that now hummed louder than ever. Martha Clay led them, no longer midwife but priestess. "The land wants thanks," she said. "The Lord left us. The hollow did not." Those who remained faithful to Boone's God gathered in secret, praying to be delivered from whatever had taken root beneath them. But even they felt it, that unseen presence pressing from below, as though something enormous and alive was shifting in the dark earth. By spring, the last entry in the surviving settler's logbook read simply, "The ground moved tonight. The trees leaned to listen. I think we've been praying to the wrong heaven." After that, silence. No letters, no trade records, no survivors. Years later, when government men stumbled upon the site, they found no living soul, Only abandoned cabins swallowed by vines and the faint outline of a circle burned into the soil where the chapel once stood. The hollow had reclaimed what was its own, and beneath the weight of moss and memory, the hum remained. When Father Elias Boone vanished from Black Hollow, the silence he left behind felt heavier than his sermons ever had. His disappearance was not sudden. It began as a slow unraveling of his faith. The man who once thundered scripture from the chapel steps had, in his final weeks, grown quiet, almost hollow himself. The settlers remembered the last sermon he gave, a strange, feverish one, where he spoke not of heaven, but of the roots beneath creation. He warned his congregation that the soil hungers, and that faith without offering is only noise. Those who heard him said his eyes looked wet with fear, as if he'd seen something unspeakable. No one expected him to vanish. Boone was the spiritual spine of the hollow, a former soldier turned preacher who believed that every hardship was a test sent by God. But his strength had been eroding. His nights were sleepless. His voice trembled when he prayed. He told Martha Clay that something was listening when he knelt to speak with God. She told him to stop praying to the sky and start listening to the earth. "It hears quicker," she said, smiling with her toothless grin. The night he disappeared, a storm rolled down the mountain. Thick fog, heavy rain, and that low, vibrating hum that had haunted the hollow since the settlers arrived. Boone's neighbors saw his lantern moving toward the woods near the old well just before midnight. He was muttering verses under his breath, though one witness, Thomas Griggs, said the words sounded backwards, as if Boone was reciting scripture in reverse. At dawn, his cabin was empty, his bed untouched, his boots gone. But on the table lay his open Bible, warped from damp air. A few pages were burned around the edges, as though a candle had hovered too long over them. The last verse marked read, "For the dust shall return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it." Except someone had written beneath it in Boone's handwriting. But what if the earth keeps what is fed to it? The settlers gathered to search. They combed through the forest, shouting his name into the mist. Dogs refused to track his scent, whining at the tree line. Near the river, they found a clearing where the ground had sunk slightly, soft as if something heavy had been buried and then unearthed. On a nearby tree, someone had carved a symbol, a spiral within a circle. Martha Clay said it was a calling mark. "He's gone below," she whispered. "He's gone where the roots drink." 3 days later, the storm broke, and with it came something stranger, the sound of humming from the well. Not the usual low vibration, but something higher, melodic, like a voice caught in water. The settlers crowded around it, peering into the dark. They could see nothing below, yet the hum grew louder the closer they leaned. A child, Samuel Griggs, cried out that he heard Boone's voice singing. Panic spread. Some believed Boone had fallen into the well, others that he had taken his own life. But Martha Clay shook her head. "He didn't fall," she said. "He was invited." That night, several men tied ropes and lowered lanterns into the well. The light disappeared quickly, swallowed by blackness that seemed too deep for a hand-dug hole. When they pulled the rope back up, it came slick with something oily, like tar. The men dropped the rope and refused to speak of it again. In the days that followed, a strange calm settled over the hollow. The humming from the well grew rhythmic, almost like chanting. Crops began sprouting again, impossibly lush. The livestock stopped dying. It was as if Boone's disappearance had somehow pleased the land. Martha Clay declared it a blessing, and the settlers, desperate for normalcy, convinced themselves that Boone had sacrificed himself for their survival. They even built a crude wooden cross near the well, carved with his name. But they didn't pray to it. They left offerings. Food, flowers, drops of blood from slaughtered animals. And yet, not all believed he was gone. A trapper passing through claimed he saw a man in black walking along the ridge 3 nights later, humming a tune no bird could sing. He carried a lantern, but its light was blue, like the color of cold metal. The man said when he called out, the figure stopped, and the humming stopped too. Then, the forest fell dead silent, and something whispered behind him, "A walk's where the roots breathe." A month passed. Boone's name was rarely spoken. Martha Clay had become the de facto leader, conducting strange gatherings by moonlight near the well. She said Boone's return would bring the hollow into balance. The settlers, bound by fear and superstition, followed her. They drew circles in the dirt before sleep, burned wax figures in secret, and whispered old prayers that sounded more like bargains than blessings. But one night, the humming changed. It deepened, slow and guttural, rising from beneath the ground itself. Windows rattled, the soil trembled, dogs howled until their throats broke. When dawn came, the wooden cross by the well had split in two. In its place lay Boone's hat, waterlogged and heavy, filled with black soil. Inside the chapel, someone had written across the altar in coal, "He is preaching below." That was the last sign of Father Boone. Years later, when the investigation into Black Hollow's disappearance began, searchers unearthed a single skeletal arm near the well. The bones were fused to the earth as though the ground itself had grown around them. The fingers were bent inward, almost in a gesture of prayer. The soil samples taken from the site contained traces of human wax, a substance never explained, never replicated. The legend of the missing preacher spread through the mountains long after the town vanished. Locals said that on certain nights, when the moon was high and the air thick, you could hear Boone's voice rising from the hollow, not preaching, but humming, a sound that made the trees bend ever so slightly toward the well. Some believed he was trapped beneath the soil, still offering sermons to something older than man. Others said he had become part of the land itself, a priest to whatever god the earth had always served. But one thing was certain after Boone's disappearance: faith in Black Hollow changed forever. The settlers no longer looked upward when they prayed. They knelt to the ground. And in the soft wind that followed their whispered devotions, the hollow always answered. After Father Boone vanished, the people of Black Hollow tried to carry on with their lives. But faith without a preacher is like a candle without a wick. The light doesn't hold for long. The hollow grew quieter, the air heavier. Crops flourished and then rotted overnight, and livestock wandered off only to be found days later, standing in circles as if frozen by some unseen hand. The settlers began to believe what no one dared to say out loud, that the hollow had accepted Boone's disappearance as a kind of offering. Into this silence stepped Martha Clay, the midwife. She had always been an odd figure, half healer, half whisperer, with roots in old country ways that most settlers called superstition. Her medicine worked when others failed. Her charm stopped fevers, and births under her care never went wrong. The people respected her, but now they began to fear her too. When Boone was gone, she claimed she could still hear him. "Not above," she said, "but below." It was Martha who first spoke of the moon prayer. She gathered the villagers one cold night when the moon was full and pale, hanging low over the trees like a single, watching eye. "The sky took our preacher," she told them, "but the ground still listens. It always has. We just forgot the old way of speaking to it." The settlers followed her to the river's edge, where she drew symbols in the mud with her finger. Circles, lines, and something that looked like a spiral eye. She told each person to prick their finger with a thorn and let a drop of blood fall into the water. "The river feeds the roots," she whispered, "and the roots remember who gives." That night, the air changed. The usual hum that haunted the hollow grew louder, more distinct, and for the first time it carried rhythm, like chanting beneath the earth. It rose and fell with the flickering of the fire, as though the hollow itself were breathing in unison with them. Martha began to hum too, low and steady, and soon others joined. Their voices didn't form words, just sound, a tone that seemed to vibrate through the chest down into the soil. When it ended, no one spoke. They simply walked home, eyes glassy and dazed, as if something inside them had been rearranged. By morning, something strange had happened. The crops that had been blackened and dying stood green again. The milk was fresh. Even the air smelled clean, almost sweet. Martha called it a blessing. The people called it proof. But moon prayer became their new ritual, not weekly, but whenever the moon rose full. Each time they gathered, the ritual grew a little more elaborate. The first time they only hummed. The next, they burned herbs, sage, pine, and something Martha called grave root, a plant no one could identify. The third time, she instructed them to bring personal belongings, hair, nails, or old tools, and bury them at the edge of the well. "The ground needs to know who you are," she said. "It needs your scent." Some began to whisper that Martha was becoming a kind of priestess. Others said she was listening to the same thing that took Boone, but where he had resisted, she obeyed. When questioned, Martha would only smile. "The hollow keeps us alive." She'd say, "You can pray to heaven if you like, but heaven hasn't answered once." It wasn't long before the rituals turned darker. One night, a man named Ezekiel Thorne refused to join. He said he'd rather die than bow to pagan nonsense. The next morning, his wife found him outside their cabin, knees buried in mud, eyes open, mouth packed with dirt. Around him, the ground had formed a perfect circle, smooth, unbroken, as if the soil had been pressed down by an enormous hand. After that, no one missed a ritual again. The moon prayer became law. With each passing month, the settlers changed in small, subtle ways. Their eyes grew dull, their skin pale. They spoke less, as though conserving breath for the hum. Children began drawing spirals on walls and carving circles into wood. A few of them would wake in the night, walk outside, and stand barefoot in the field, staring up at the moon, mouths open but silent. When asked why, one little girl said, "It's listening for us." Martha Clay's influence deepened. She wore a necklace of small bones and kept her hands stained with ash. The others began calling her Mother Clay, a title that made her smile. She said the hollow had chosen her to keep the balance. Some settlers noticed that her shadow moved strangely, slower than her body, as if dragged through thicker air. One night, she led them farther into the woods, to a clearing none had seen before. There, she uncovered an old stone slab covered in moss and strange carvings. The symbols matched those on Boone's burned sermon. She called it the Listening Stone. She told them this was where Boone had first heard the ground's voice. She placed her palms on the stone and began to hum again. The sound vibrated through the forest, deep and unearthly, and the trees seemed to lean closer, as if eavesdropping. As the settlers joined in, their breath turned white in the air, though it was midsummer. The hum became a single tone that grew until it was almost unbearable. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Some fell to their knees, clutching their chests as if the sound were inside them. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. And then, faintly, a voice, not Martha's, not human, echoing from the well in the distance. "I hear you." That night, no one slept. The animals refused to move. Even the river seemed to still. Martha claimed it was a sign that the hollow had finally awakened. "It's listening now," she told them, eyes wide with feverish joy. "We're safe," but safety never came. Days later, the soil near the well began to crack open in small places, like breathing pores. The settlers reported dreams of white figures standing at their doors, whispering their names backward. The crops grew enormous but began to pulse faintly like living flesh. Still, the rituals continued. They had to. Fear had become faith, and faith had turned to debt. By autumn, the people of Black Hollow no longer prayed to heaven. Their eyes turned to the soil, their songs aimed downward, their hearts tuned to the hum that never stopped. The hollow had answered their prayers, and now it was waiting for its payment. By the spring of 1821, Black Hollow was unrecognizable from the hopeful settlement it had once been. The cabins that had echoed with hymns and laughter now stood half sunken in mud, their roofs warped from endless moisture. The people moved through the village like ghosts, silent, wary, their eyes fixed always on the ground. Only at night did life stir again, when the moonlight returned, and with it, the soft hum that had become as familiar as breath. It was around this time that the symbols began appearing. The first to notice them was a woodcutter named Jacob Hayne, a broad-shouldered man known for his strength and short temper. He had gone into the forest one dawn to fell a tree for firewood. The fog was thick that morning, curling low like smoke, muffling every sound except the distant trickle of the river. When his axe struck the trunk, the bark split away to reveal a shape beneath, a perfect spiral burned deep into the wood, smooth as if seared by iron. The mark seemed to pulse faintly, glistening with sap that smelled like blood. Jacob thought it a trick of nature, until he saw another one a few feet away, then another. The marks were everywhere, etched into the trees in a wide ring around the settlement. Each one identical, precise, too deliberate to be coincidence. He ran back to the village, breathless, shouting for the others. They followed him to the tree line, torches in hand, and saw for themselves the forest branded with symbols. Some crossed themselves, others simply stood staring. Martha Clay, her face unreadable, knelt by one of the spirals and pressed her palm against it. The sap clung to her skin. When she looked up, her eyes gleamed strangely in the firelight. "It's the hollow's mark," she said. "The roots are rising closer. It's claiming us proper." Her words split the settlement in two. Half the villagers believed her, that the symbols were a sign of protection, proof that the land accepted their worship. The other half believed it was a warning. Among the latter was Thomas Griggs, the blacksmith, who still prayed to the Christian God every dawn. He said the marks were devil's writing, that the land had turned against them. He begged Martha to let him burn the trees. She refused. "You don't burn what blesses you," she said coldly. "You feed it." That night, the air turned colder than usual. The hum returned, louder now, rippling through the soil and walls. It carried an almost intelligible rhythm, as though the hollow was speaking in a language too deep for words. The next morning, Thomas Griggs was gone. His forge was cold, his hammer still warm from use, and his boots stood neatly by the door. But what chilled the settlers most was the sight outside his cabin, a row of trees newly marked, spirals fresh and blackened, forming a perfect path from his doorstep to the well. After that, the symbols multiplied. They appeared overnight, etched higher on trunks, carved into doorframes, even into the wooden beams of the chapel. No one ever saw them being made, but everyone woke to find more. They began to shimmer faintly under the moon, and sometimes people swore they heard them whisper. When wind passed through the forest, it didn't sound like rustling. It sounded like breathing. Martha claimed it was a blessing, a way for the hollow to speak through its skin. She began marking the same spirals on the foreheads of the sick, tracing them in ash and honey. Some recovered. Some didn't. Either way, no one protested anymore. The forest had become both god and graveyard, but not all accepted it. One night, Jacob Hayne, who had first discovered the symbols, took his axe and went into the woods alone. He told his wife he was going to cut the devil's tongue out of the trees. He never came back. Days later, they found his axe near the well, its blade warped as if melted, the handle slick with something black and sticky. The spiral marks around the well were darker now, glimmering like wet ink. In his cabin, beneath his bed, they found a small cloth pouch filled with bark chips, each one carved with the same symbol. His wife swore she had never seen them before. Martha said Jacob had been chosen. The hollow needed his hands, she whispered. It took them back. Soon after, a new sound joined the hum, a faint tapping, like wood knocking against wood, echoing from the trees at night. Some said it was branches in the wind. Others said it was Jacob still chopping, deeper beneath the ground. The settlers began to lose track of days. The forest seemed to close in, the light dimming faster each evening. And yet, the trees closest to the village never died. Even in the heart of winter, their leaves stayed green. When snow fell, it melted before touching the bark. The symbols beneath seemed to radiate faint warmth as though the hollow was alive, pulsing just under the surface. Then one evening, a small girl named Lydia Thorne wandered too far while gathering firewood. When she returned, she was silent, her eyes glazed, her hands smeared with sap. Her father demanded to know where she'd been. She only whispered. The trees sang my name. When they washed her hands, the sap would not come off. The following morning, the townsfolk awoke to find every door and window in Black Hollow marked. The same spiral, the same faint, dark sheen. Martha Clay ordered everyone to remain calm. It's the Hollow's protection, she said. It wants to keep us safe. But her voice trembled, and some swore they saw her tracing a second, smaller mark into her own palm. A shape not quite a spiral, not quite human. From that day onward, the settlers avoided the forest. They lived in the clearing, unwilling to venture beyond the edge of the marked trees. But the symbols spread regardless, creeping closer, climbing higher, as though the forest itself was breathing in, preparing to swallow them whole. By midsummer, even the sky above Black Hollow seemed dimmer. The moonlight reached the ground in strange, circular pools, just like the spirals. The hum from below never stopped, and when it rose at night, the symbols on the trees would shimmer faintly, as if responding. The hollow had found its voice, and the settlers, whether they understood it or not, had become its congregation. By autumn of 1821, Black Hollow had begun to rot from the inside out. The air stank of mildew and fear, and even the birds had long since stopped singing. The forest pressed closer with every passing week, its canopy thick enough to choke the sunlight. The settlers could no longer tell where the clearing ended and the trees began. The symbols, those black spirals of sap and soot, had crawled up every wall, every door, every surface of the settlement as though painted by invisible hands. That was when the burned cabin appeared, No one saw it catch fire. No smoke rose. No sparks glowed in the night sky. Yet one morning, the settlers awoke to the scent of ash hanging thick over the village. When they followed it, they found the Clay family's cabin, Martha's old home, blackened to the foundation. The walls had folded inward, timber melted like wax, and the ground beneath was a field of cinders. But what unsettled everyone most wasn't that the cabin had burned. It was that there had been no heat, no scorch marks spreading outward, and no sign that anything else around it had caught fire. The forest was untouched. The grass, still damp with morning dew. It was as if the fire had burned only where it was meant to, guided by unseen hands. Inside the ruins, they found Martha's book, the one she always kept near her hearth. Somehow, impossibly, it had survived the flames. The pages were charred at the edges but legible, filled with strange symbols and circles drawn in charcoal. The last page bore a single sentence in Martha's trembling handwriting. The hollow must feed. Martha herself was gone. Some believed she'd fled into the forest, that she had given herself over to whatever lived beneath the soil. Others whispered that the hollow had taken her as payment for the protection she had promised. But one old man, Jonah Pike, swore he'd seen her that night before the fire. He claimed she stood by the well, staring at the water, whispering in a voice that didn't sound like her own. When he called out to her, she didn't move. She only raised her hand and pressed her palm to her chest. The next morning, the cabin was gone. The settlers decided to bury what remained of the ruins, believing that if they covered the ashes, the hollow would forget. But when they dug into the ground, they struck something hard beneath the foundation, a layer of blackened wood and bone. Dozens of small bones, thin as twigs, stacked in a circle. And in the center of that circle was a stone carved with the same spiral that had haunted them for months. They covered it quickly and said nothing. That night, the humming under the ground grew louder than ever. It vibrated through the earth like a pulse, shaking the dishes on shelves and the water in their buckets. Some villagers heard voices in it, low and distant, overlapping, like hundreds of people whispering in unison. The next day, another house caught fire, then another. But the pattern was always the same: no heat, no spreading flame, just silent ruin. Each burned structure sat black and hollow, untouched by smoke, as though the fire had come from beneath, not above. By the end of the week, 5 cabins had vanished. Panic seized the settlement. Some families fled into the mountains, only to vanish completely. Those who stayed began sleeping outside, too afraid to be under a roof. They lit candles and fires around the clearing, hoping the light would keep the hollow's darkness at bay. But the flames flickered low and green, and the smoke curled inward, back toward the ground. Then came the night of the moonless silence. For the first time in months, the hum stopped. The villagers gathered in the open, trembling, unsure if the quiet was mercy or a warning. The air was so still that even breathing sounded loud. They waited, staring into the black line of the forest until a faint orange glow appeared in the distance. It was another fire. Jacob Haynes' abandoned cabin, the one at the edge of the woods, was burning, this time with real flames, high and wild. The settlers ran toward it with buckets, shouting, but as they approached, they froze. Figures stood inside the flames. Not silhouettes of people burning, but shapes of light, shimmering, moving slowly, as though dancing. The air around the cabin warped and rippled, like heat haze on a summer road. When the fire died, the cabin was gone again, this time entirely gone. No ash, no embers, no remains. Just a perfect circle of scorched earth where it had stood, the soil black and smooth like glass. At the center of the circle lay a single object, a charred human heart still faintly beating. No one dared touch it. By dawn, it was gone too. From that night onward, the fires spread not by sight but by sound. The settlers would wake to the faint crackle of burning wood, only to find nothing aflame. Sometimes the walls would glow faintly red, as though lit from within, and then fade back to gray. Children began drawing spirals in the dirt without knowing why. Livestock refused to enter the clearing. The air itself smelled like old smoke and iron. A preacher passing through the valley months later wrote that he'd heard stories of a ghost town swallowed by the ground. He found no ruins, no smoke, not even the remains of a fire, only a wide patch of black soil and trees bearing spiral scars, scars that still bled sap when touched. Some say Martha Clay's spirit still moves through those woods, whispering to the trees, feeding the hollow in exchange for peace that never came. Others believe the hollow burned away everything human from that place, leaving only the memory of what was offered to it. Whatever truth lay beneath those ashes, one thing was certain: the fire had never stopped burning. It simply moved underground, waiting, patient, until another soul dared to build where it once fed. And when that day comes, as it always does, the first sign won't be smoke or flame. It will be the hum, the low, steady heartbeat of a land that remembers every name ever burned upon it. By the winter of 1822, Black Hollow was more grave than settlement. The trees had overtaken the land, their black roots pushing through the soil like ribs breaking through flesh. The well that once gave the settlers their water now whispered when approached, murmuring words that no one dared to understand. What was left of the villagers lived in silence, each one haunted by the same sound. A rhythm that rose from the ground only at night. It wasn't the hum anymore. It was something deeper, older. It had become a song. The survivors called it the lyric of blood and stone. No one knew who first gave it the name. It was simply what it was, a melody of vibration and pulse, as though the hollow itself were breathing through the bedrock. The sound began soft, like a heartbeat under earth, then swelled into a mournful tune that twisted through the trees. When it played, the spiral marks glowed faintly, and the ground trembled in sync, as if the entire valley moved to one rhythm. At first, the settlers tried to ignore it. They plugged their ears with wax, sang hymns over it, or fled their homes to sleep by the river. But the lyric always found them. It hummed through wood, through bone, through dreams. People began to wake with bleeding ears and the taste of soil in their mouths. One man, Elias Crow, claimed he could hear words in the song. He said the lyric spoke in patterns, a repetition of names, syllables of things buried. He wrote them down on scraps of bark, covering his walls with twisting lines and circles. When others asked what they meant, he only said, "It's remembering us." A week later, Elias vanished. His house stood empty, its walls covered in markings made from his own blood. The words were unreadable except for one phrase carved deep into the doorframe: "It sings when it eats." After that, no one could deny that the hollow was alive. Children began humming the tune in their sleep. Mothers swore they could hear their dead husbands' voices inside it, calling from beneath the ground. The lyric wove through their lives until silence itself felt unnatural. It was as if the valley had taught them to exist only within its music. Then came the night of the stone's cry. The few who still dared to leave their cabins gathered near the old well, where the hum seemed strongest. The moon was blood red, hanging low between the trees. The earth shook with a rhythm like drums, steady, deliberate. Suddenly, a crack split the ground beside the well, spilling a thin line of red liquid. It wasn't water. It was too thick, too warm. The smell of iron filled the air. From the crack rose a stone, smooth, black, and wet with blood. Its surface glowed faintly, and carved upon it was the same spiral that had cursed them since the first day. But this time, the symbol pulsed. It throbbed like a living thing. When Martha Clay's book was found months earlier, it had mentioned something called the heart beneath the rock. Now the settlers understood. The hollow wasn't just earth and roots. It was a body, and they were standing inside it. As the stone rose higher, the song grew louder, clearer. The settlers fell to their knees, not out of worship, but because the vibration tore through their bones. Their teeth chattered, their eyes watered, and some began to bleed from their noses. The lyric wasn't a sound anymore. It was a force. It pushed into their chests, rearranging heartbeats, demanding they match its rhythm. And one by one, they did. When the song reached its peak, the villagers began to move, not in panic, but in eerie synchronization. Their eyes rolled white, their mouths open in silent echo. They walked toward the well, hands outstretched, as though being pulled by invisible strings. The first to reach it was Lydia Thorne, the little girl who had once said the trees sang her name. Without hesitation, she climbed onto the edge and leaned forward. Her body dropped without a sound. One by one, others followed, men, women, even the frail and the old, until the well swallowed them all. The lyric roared now, louder than thunder, shaking the mountains around them. The spiral on the stone flared bright red, and then, as quickly as it began, the sound stopped. When the silence fell, it was absolute. The moonlight dimmed. The air turned cold. By dawn, the well had collapsed in on itself. The earth sealed over the hole as if it had never been there. No bodies were found, no blood, no trace of the villagers who had vanished into the hollow's mouth. Only the stone remained, half buried in the dirt, still faintly pulsing. Weeks later, travelers passing through the valley found the site of Black Hollow. There were no cabins, no signs of life. Just an endless forest of dark trees bearing spiral marks that shimmered when touched. Beneath one of those trees, they discovered a strange resonance, a low vibration that could be felt through the soles of their boots. They said, if you stood still long enough, you could hear it. Not a hum, not a voice, but a melody. It rose and fell like breath, and within it, faintly, you could hear words that didn't belong to any language. Yet every person who listened swore they understood the same message deep in their bones. Why are the roots now? To this day, locals in the Appalachian highlands speak of that valley in whispers. They say the ground there still sings when the moon is red, and if you follow the tune, it will lead you to a circle of stones carved with spirals. Beneath that circle, the lyric sleeps, waiting for new voices to join its song. No one builds there anymore. No animals linger long. But sometimes travelers say they hear something underfoot when the wind dies down. A pulse, a rhythm. The faint rise of music coming from below. The lyric of blood and stone still plays in the dark, patient and eternal, remembering every soul it ever swallowed. And one day, when the roots rise again, it will sing their names once more. When the settlers of Black Hollow still numbered more than a handful, before the fires and the song, there was one man who refused to kneel, Jacob Hayne. A woodsman by trade, strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. He'd been among the first to settle in the valley. He believed in what he could see and strike with his axe. Nothing more. The stories of the hollow, the whispers about spirits in the soil were to him just the fears of the weak. But by the spring of 1821, even Jacob began to feel that the woods were watching him back. It started with the sound. The low hum underfoot that made his axe tremble in his grip. Then came the marks. Those spirals burned into the trees that surrounded his land. At first, he ignored them. Then he tried to cut them away, but each morning the carvings returned, deeper, darker, as though the forest were healing itself. His wife begged him to stop. She said the hollow didn't like it when you fought it. Jacob only spat in the dirt and said, "Let it come for me then." That night, something did. He woke before dawn to the sound of chopping, his own axe striking wood outside. When he stumbled out of bed, the air was thick with fog, the moon still clinging to the horizon. There in the clearing near his shed stood a figure. Broad-shouldered, dressed in his own work clothes, swinging an axe in steady rhythm. Jacob shouted, but the figure didn't stop. When he drew closer, the thing turned its head, and he saw his own face staring back at him. The double smiled once, then sank the axe into the ground. The soil shuddered. The hum returned, and when Jacob blinked, the figure was gone. He told no one, not even his wife. But from that night onward, Jacob Hayne was never the same. He stopped cutting trees. He stopped sleeping in his cabin. Most nights, he sat by the well with a lantern, whispering to himself. Sometimes he pressed his ear against the ground, listening. Once his wife heard him murmuring, "It wants its hands back." 3 days later, he vanished. The last person to see him alive was his neighbor, Jonah Pike, who said Jacob had been dragging something heavy toward the woods. A long bundle wrapped in canvas, leaving a dark trail behind it. When Jonah called out, Jacob just kept walking. He disappeared between the trees and the hum grew louder for a moment, then stopped. At sunrise, his wife found his axe propped against the well, its handle slick with sap that smelled faintly metallic. Around the well were fresh spiral carvings, still warm to the touch. Inside the house, everything was untouched. His clothes folded, his boots by the door, his bed empty but undisturbed. The only sign of movement was the dirt under his nails, black and wet, as though he'd been digging. The villagers searched the forest for days, calling his name until their voices cracked. They found no trace of him. No blood, no torn clothing, nothing. Yet every night after his disappearance, someone would hear the sound of chopping in the distance, steady, rhythmic, too deliberate to be wind. When they followed it, the sound always moved deeper into the woods, leading them in circles until dawn. Weeks passed before anyone dared to return to his cabin. When they did, they found something waiting. On the wall above his bed was a single handprint, large, dark, and sunken into the wood as if burned there. Beneath it, carved carefully with a knife, were words no one ever forgot. "I found the roots." That night, the forest fell silent. The hum that had haunted them for months ceased completely. The villagers felt relief at first, believing the curse had ended with Jacob's disappearance. But silence in Black Hollow was never a blessing, it was a warning. By the next moon, the trees began to bleed. Thin lines of red sap oozed from the spiral carvings, dripping onto the ground like tears. The well water turned cloudy and smelled faintly of iron. When the villagers tried to flee, the paths out of the valley changed. Trails they had walked their whole lives now curved back toward the settlement. No matter which direction they ran, the forest led them home. And every time they passed the old stump near Jacob's clearing, they swore they could hear the sound of chopping beneath the earth. Not from above, from below. Years later, when travelers stumbled upon the ruins of Black Hollow, they found Jacob's cabin still standing, though swallowed almost whole by roots. The door hung open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with damp rot. The bed frame had collapsed. The fireplace crumbled, but the wall with the handprint remained. It was darker now, the wood around it soft as flesh. When one of the travelers touched it, the entire cabin trembled. The ground outside shifted, groaning, and from somewhere deep beneath the floor came the unmistakable sound of wood striking wood. 8 slow, heavy blows. Then silence. They fled before sunset, too terrified to look back. But one man claimed that as they left, he turned once toward the tree line and saw a figure standing there. A tall man with an axe over his shoulder, his face pale as bone, his eyes hollow and shining. He didn't move, he only watched. Later, when they reached the nearest town and told their story, an old woman nodded grimly. She'd heard it before. "That's Jacob Hayne," she said. "Still chopping for the hollow. It keeps him so it doesn't have to wake." To this day, locals swear that when the fog settles deep in the Appalachian woods, you can still hear it. The sound of the axe. Always 8 strikes. Always at dusk. No one knows what Jacob found beneath that soil, or whether he ever truly disappeared at all. But the marks on the trees near his clearing still bleed, and the air there still vibrates faintly like breath caught beneath the earth. And when the wind blows just right, you can hear the rhythm again. Pause. Chop. The song of a man who defied the hollow and became part of its music forever. By the spring of 1823, what little remained of Black Hollow was wrapped in legend and silence. The valley that once shimmered with hope now sat beneath a permanent veil of mist, as though the sky itself refused to look down upon it. The few surviving settlers who had not fled, or been taken, spoke of one thing only in hushed tones: the mine. The story of the silver mine began long before the settlers built their cabins. Local Shawnee and Monoton tribes had avoided the valley for generations, calling it the place where the ground drinks light. They said silver ran through the veins of the mountain, but the ore was cursed. Moon metal, they called it, because it bled when broken. To dig into it was to wound the hollow, and the hollow always healed by taking something in return. But greed has always been louder than warning. It was Nathaniel Pike, the brother of Jonah, who first spoke of reopening the mine. He claimed he'd seen silver veins glimmering near the ridge where the soil cracked after the fires. The others told him to leave it buried, but hunger had made them desperate. Food was running thin, their livestock sick, their faith hollowed out. Nathaniel said the silver could save them. Trade it for supplies, for escape, for anything that wasn't this dying place. On a cold morning, he and 2 others, Samuel Tuck and Mary Griggs, went into the forest with shovels and lanterns. The air was heavy with that strange hum again, faint and pulsing, but they ignored it. They found the cave mouth behind a curtain of roots, a jagged slit in the hillside where cold air breathed out like the sigh of a beast. Inside, the walls shimmered faintly even in darkness, veins of silver glowing under the lantern light like wet skin. They began to dig. The deeper they went, the more the light seemed to twist around them. The silver pulsed under their hands, and the rhythm of their picks matched the faint beat rising from the earth. When Samuel struck a particularly bright vein, the entire cave seemed to groan. Dust rained from the ceiling. The hum became a low, angry moan. Mary swore she saw the metal move, flowing away from their tools like veins recoiling from pain. But Nathaniel only grinned. "It's alive," he said. "And that means it's endless." They dug until their arms shook. When they finally turned back toward the entrance, they found it gone, sealed by roots that hadn't been there before. Panic erupted. Their lanterns flickered. The air grew thick, hot, alive. Then the song began. the lyric of blood and stone rising from the walls themselves, vibrating through the picks and shovels, filling their lungs. Samuel screamed that the walls were bleeding, and he was right. From every crack, thick red sap poured out, warm and metallic, pooling at their feet. Nathaniel tried to climb the slope, clawing at the roots with his bare hands. They didn't move. Instead, they pulsed, gripping tighter, dragging him down. The last thing Mary remembered before the lanterns went out was Nathaniel's voice, shouting over the roar of the lyric. "It's not silver, it's bone." By dawn, only Mary Griggs stumbled back into the settlement. Her hands were shredded, her hair white, her eyes wide with a kind of terror that can't be named. She said nothing for 2 days, only muttered the same phrase over and over. It sang me out. When she finally spoke, she said the mine had changed shape behind them, that the tunnels were breathing, and that the silver was not metal but frozen veins running through a body too vast to comprehend. The others didn't believe her, until her skin began to change. Within a week, faint silver lines appeared beneath her flesh, tracing up her arms like rivers. Her veins glowed faintly at night, and when anyone touched her, they said she felt cold, hard, metallic. She stopped eating. Her voice grew faint, echoing as if spoken from a deep well. By the 3rd week, she was gone. All that remained was a patch of dirt by her bed that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. A month later, the miners' tools were found neatly stacked outside the mine entrance, rusted but spotless. The cave itself had vanished. The hill where it once stood was smooth, unbroken as though it had never been there at all. Only the air above it shimmered faintly, like heat on summer stone. From then on, the survivors spoke of the silver mine curse. They said the hollow had veins like any living creature, and that digging into them drew its attention. The silver was not treasure. It was tissue bone, a kind of sacred anatomy. To take from it was to carve into the flesh of a sleeping god. Travelers who came later claimed they could still find pieces of silver in the dirt around the valley. But they never kept them long. The metal would hum faintly at night, vibrating on tables or inside pockets, matching the rhythm of the heartbeat beneath the earth. Some who carried it said they began to dream of tunnels, long twisting, pulsing with light, and of a voice whispering through stone, "Dig deeper. Feed the root." One blacksmith in a nearby town melted his piece of silver down to make a crucifix, believing it might turn the curse to good. But the cross blackened overnight, and by morning his forge had collapsed inward, leaving only a hole that smelled of blood and sulfur. Even now, locals say the soil in that part of the Appalachian range gleams faintly after rain. And if you stand there long enough, the ground feels warm, like something sleeping just beneath, dreaming in silver and blood. No one dares to dig anymore. But sometimes, when the wind cuts through the pines, the forest gives a low metallic sigh, like the shifting of enormous chains far below the surface. That's when the elders whisper. The hollow remembers. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the lyric again, soft and distant. The song that once rose from the silver veins of a living mountain, hungry still, waiting for someone foolish enough to make it bleed again. By the winter of 1824, Black Hollow had become a place of half-whispered prayers and waking nightmares. The fires in the cabins never seemed to warm the bones, and the shadows in the forest stretched longer than they should have. The silver veins had stopped glowing, but the hum beneath the ground had not. It came at night, soft as breath, steady as a heartbeat. Those who remained after the silver mine curse were few, 7 settlers in all, and each bore some mark of the hollow's touch. Elias Wren, the preacher who had buried more friends than he could count, claimed that the valley itself was haunted by the broken covenant between man and the land. He said their only hope lay not in running, but in atonement. Elias spoke of a ritual, one he had found mentioned in the weathered journals of the hollow's first settlers. It told of a time when the land demanded offerings, not of death, but of faith freely given. If they could restore the balance by pledging themselves to the hollow, maybe the hunger would quiet. Maybe the earth would sleep again. But there was a problem. The ritual was incomplete. The pages that described it were torn, burned, or missing. All that remained were fragments, phrases about moonlight on soil, silvered hands clasped in circle, and the name of the sleeping one. Elias believed that under the first full moon of winter, they could piece the ritual together, guided by instinct and desperation. The night came cold and clear, the stars sharp as nails. The moon hung low and swollen. its light bathing the valley in a pale, almost metallic glow. The 7 gathered in the clearing at the edge of the woods, where the old well stood, the same well from which the first settlers had drawn their water, and later into which they had thrown their dead. They formed a circle around it, hands clasped. In the center, Elias placed a small bowl filled with silver dust scraped from the tools left by Nathaniel Pike and the miners. The dust shimmered under the moonlight, pulsing faintly, as though remembering the blood it once had tasted. Elias began to speak. His words were slow, trembling. Not English, not Latin, something older. Something that didn't belong to the tongue of man. The others repeated after him, their voices uneven but eager, desperate. The wind shifted. The forest grew still. Even the night insects fell silent. Then the earth began to breathe. It started as a faint pulse under their feet, 1, 2, 3, until it matched the rhythm of their hearts. The ground was warm, almost alive, and when Elias raised his hands, the silver dust lifted from the bowl, swirling into the air like ash caught in invisible wind. The settlers gasped as it formed shapes, faces faint outlines of those who had vanished. Nathaniel Pike, Mary Griggs, the children taken by the hollow. Their expressions were neither peaceful nor angry. They looked expectant, like witnesses to something that had yet to happen. Elias continued the chant, his voice deepening, his eyes glowing faintly with reflected moonlight. Then came the part no one expected. The well began to hum, a soft, melodic vibration that rose from its depths. The sound was beautiful at first, pure as a choir note, but soon it deepened, stretched, became layered until it no longer sounded like music but like voices speaking in unison, hundreds of them, whispering through stone. Elias's voice faltered. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "It's answering us." But the others were no longer looking at him. Their eyes were fixed on the silver dust that now encircled them, forming a thin ring on the ground. Inside that ring, the soil shimmered wetly, dark, red, and alive. Something was stirring beneath. A tremor ran through the clearing, and the moonlight flickered as though the sky itself had blinked. The ground bulged, split, and from the crack rose a figure, not a man, not a beast, but something between the two. Its form was faint, made of dust and shadow, its eyes twin voids of light. Elias fell to his knees. "The guardian," he whispered. "The hollow's keeper." The figure spoke, though not with words. Its voice entered their minds, slow and heavy, like thought turned to stone. It said they had awakened what should have slept forever. It said the pact was not to heal, but to bind. The settlers' ancestors had once bargained with the hollow, to take silver from its veins in exchange for service. Their descendants had broken the pact when they dug without offering, without reverence. Now, to restore balance, the pact must be renewed. But every pact demands payment. The figure reached toward Elias. His eyes widened, but he did not resist. "If my soul can save the rest," he said. "Take it." The shadow pressed its hand against his chest. Light burst from within him, silver, blinding, pure. For a moment, he looked young again, strong, his face serene. Then he collapsed, his body turning pale and brittle like ash blown into shape. The figure dissolved with him, fading into mist that sank back into the soil. The silver dust fell still, the hum stopped, the ground went cold. When the survivors opened their eyes, the clearing was empty. The well was gone. In its place was a shallow pit filled with clear water, reflecting the moon perfectly. The valley was silent again. They returned to their cabins, shaken but alive. For the first time in years, the night was quiet. No hum, no whispering trees, no shifting shadows. It seemed Elias's sacrifice had worked. But peace is rarely without a price. In the days that followed, the survivors began to dream of Elias standing at the bottom of the well. That was his skin silver, his eyes hollow, whispering in a voice that sounded like the wind through the pines. "Keep the pact. Feed the hollow. When it hungers again, you will know." And indeed they did. For on the 7th night after the ritual, the moon turned red, and the reflection in the pit rippled, not with water, but with something that moved on its own. From that night forward, every full moon, the soil in the clearing would glow faintly, as though something beneath was breathing, waiting for another offering to renew the pact Elias had begun. The settlers no longer prayed to heaven. They prayed to the hollow, and the hollow, for the first time, listened. By the autumn of 1825, what was once the settlement of Black Hollow had become a memory the mountain itself seemed to reject. The cabins sagged under rot and silence. The fields that once produced miraculous crops had gone dry and gray. The soil cracked like dead skin. The river no longer sang. Even the crows had stopped coming. The few who survived the moonlit pact lived like ghosts, tired, hollow-eyed, clinging to a peace that felt borrowed. Every night they prayed at the edge of the clearing where the well had once stood, whispering the same words Elias had spoken before he gave himself to the hollow. But lately their prayers had begun to echo. The ground beneath them no longer felt still. It began again with a hum, soft, distant, rising from the soil like the memory of thunder. Then came the scent, iron and rain, and a faint shimmer spreading through the dirt. At first, they mistook it for morning dew, until they realized the shimmer wasn't light, it was movement. The ground itself seemed to pulse beneath their feet. Martha Clay was the first to understand. The midwife had once guided life into the world. Now she could feel death coming the same way. A rhythm in her bones, a pull in the air. She told the others that the hollow was hungry again. The pact had not been a gift, it had been a lease, and it was time to pay. The hollow doesn't want silver, she whispered, staring at the dying fields. It wants the harvest. At first, they didn't understand. The crops were long dead. There was nothing left to reap, but then the earth began to open. Not wide, not violent, just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Rows of pale shapes, buried shallow, wrapped in roots and thin, pulsing veins of silver. Bodies, dozens of them, those who had vanished in the years since the founding of Black Hollow. But these bodies were not rotting. They looked preserved, faces still soft, eyes closed as if sleeping. When the settlers tried to touch them, the ground seemed to breathe, a long exhale that rattled the air. The silver veins beneath the corpses shimmered like arteries. And then, slowly, impossibly, one of the bodies opened its eyes. It was Nathaniel Pike, the miner who had first found the silver. His skin was gray and faintly luminous, his veins bright with metallic light. He looked at Martha and spoke a single word that no one there could forget, Sow. Then the wind rose. The settlers fled to their cabins, but the storm followed them, not of rain or hail, but of dust and whispers. The trees swayed without wind, their branches forming shapes like arms. The soil outside began to churn, and from it came the figures of the dead, moving as though pulled by invisible strings. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. Only the hum, that endless, hollow sound that now filled the valley like a heartbeat. Martha gathered the last survivors, 5 in all, and led them into the chapel. It was half collapsed, but the altar still stood there. She lit the last of the oil lamps and set out the psalms Elias had left behind. The others begged her to pray for deliverance. She shook her head. There is no deliverance here, she said. Only completion. She opened the psalm book. The words inside had changed. The pages shimmered faintly, letters shifting as though alive. What she read was not scripture, but instruction. A ritual, not for protection, but for returning. The hollow had fed on fear, faith, and blood, but it wanted what it was promised centuries before: renewal. It wanted life to return to the soil, not as crops, but as flesh and soul. The harvest had come due. One by one, the settlers realized what had to be done. The hollow would not take them by force. It demanded they give themselves freely, just as Elias had. To resist would only prolong the hunger. So, under the red harvest moon, they walked from the chapel and returned to the clearing. The pit still reflected the sky perfectly. The air was heavy and still. One by one, they knelt and pressed their hands to the ground. Martha was last. As she touched the soil, the earth seemed to sigh, deep, satisfied. The hum became a song. Light rippled through the valley, silver and red, pulsing like a heartbeat. The bodies of the settlers sank slowly into the ground as though the earth were swallowing them whole, not violently, but with reverence. By dawn, the valley was silent again. No trace of the settlers remained. Only the crops had returned, tall, golden, and heavy with grain, waving gently in a wind that came from nowhere. Travelers who passed through that season spoke of a small, fertile hollow where the corn grew unnaturally tall and the soil was black as ink. They said the air there smelled sweet, almost like blood. In 1836, a group of explorers found the site while mapping the mountains. They took samples of the soil, noting its richness, and one of them, an old botanist named Dr. Caro, decided to plant a small test crop. Within 3 days, the seeds sprouted. Within a week, the plants began to hum. Dr. Caro left that night. His notes ended with one line scrawled in haste: "The ground is alive, and it remembers. Today, the location of Black Hollow is unknown." Maps of the Appalachian Range show no record of any valley where it should be. Yet hunters and hikers still speak of a strange stretch of woodland where the trees grow in perfect circles, and the wind carries a faint melody that sounds almost like chanting. They say if you dig into the soil there, you'll find it rich, red, and warm to the touch. Some call it cursed, others sacred. But the truth lies somewhere in between, because the hollow did not die. It was never meant to. It simply waits as it always has, patient and quiet beneath the hills, its harvest renewed, its hunger asleep for now, and when the moon turns red again, the soil will stir, the hum will return, and somewhere in the dark, the hollow will remember the names of those who fed it.